The topic of my presentation reflects the book that I published recently, The Scaffolds of the Church, and I'd like to present to you some hypotheses of the book and to share with you some insights and probably to invite you to criticize those hypotheses. And the basic hypothesis of my ecclesiological project is that in the church we need to distinguish between its nature and what is around nature. I call this thing, what is around the nature of the church, scaffolds. And I purposely use this word because in English it has double meaning. It is just the construction around a building that helps us to build a house, or it's a place where people get executed. Well, the scaffolds of the church also, I believe, may have this double meaning because they can be helpful in building the church, and at the same time they can develop into something which torment the church, which actually causes a lot of pain to the church. My hypothesis that there is a distinction between the nature and what is around the nature of the scaffolds, the structures of the church, is based on the Christological theorem that the natures of the Logos incarnated do not change. Given that the church is the continuation of the incarnation, it is, I think, logical to extrapolate some Christological insights and categories to ecclesiology. And I argue that there are unchangeable and changeable elements in the church. There is an unchangeable core, which constitutes the nature of the church, and the changeable structures of the church. Actually, the book that I'm talking about, The Scaffolds of the Church, it is a second book after the first book that I published, the Meta-Ecclesiology, where I took a more epistemological approach to the phenomenon of the church, and I studied actually the self-consciousness of the church, or the self-awareness of the church, how the church perceives itself through the centuries. And I also argue that in this self-consciousness of the church, there is a core which doesn't change. The perception of the church about itself has a part in it which doesn't change, and there is a changeable part in the self-consciousness, self-awareness of the church. That's how I apply the epistemological approach to the self-consciousness of the church, and I actually try to play with the analytic philosophy and the phenomenology to describe this self-consciousness of the church. In the scaffolds of the church, I apply structural analysis and distinguish between the unchangeable core of the church, which, as I said, which I call nature, and its structures. The criterion that I use to distinguish between them is Christological. Nature is what always existed in the church and never changed. Structures or scaffolds are elements of the church that emerged in time and changed. It's just like in Jesus Christ. We believe that the two natures of Christ, they never change. They didn't change. They don't change and will not change. And that is their basic feature. In the same sense, the nature of the church doesn't change either. Among the elements of the church's core, church's nature, I believe, are such things as the faith in Jesus Christ, such as sacraments, and I believe communities. Well, I also present communities as, if you want, hypostasis of the church. Hypostasis is not just a person. Hypostasis is everything, a concrete, a particular incarnation of the common nature. So if we believe that there is a universal nature of the church, this nature should have concrete manifestations, hypostasis, and I believe that the communities are such concrete manifestations of the church's nature, and they constitute the core of the church's nature. Among the structures, I would distinguish supracommunal structures, including dioceses, metropolitanates, patriarchates, and so forth. So those administrative structures emerged in the time during the church's history, they connected communities and they helped, facilitated communities to be in touch with one another, to be in communion with one another. And they changed all the time. Therefore, I believe that there is a radical difference between a community and supracommunal structures that bridge communities. And while community is really important, it is at the core of the church. The supracommunal structures, including dioceses, patriarchates, and so forth, they are those scaffolds. They are rather a virtual reality of the church, if you want, in the modern language. In the same vein, I would say that hierarchy, I consider the concept of hierarchy, and I believe hierarchy is, even though it is widely believed to be at the core of the church, that the church, we believe, well, many people believe that the church is hierarchical by its nature, and hierarchy belongs to the nature. I believe, in the contrast to that, that hierarchy is not the nature of the church, because hierarchy emerged at a later stage, when the supracommunal structures began developing, and they went through a long process of evolution which continues. This indicates the change of those supracommunal structures, hierarchical structures. This change indicates that they are not a permanent feature of the church, that hierarchy is just a structure. And at the same time, well, and also it should be mentioned that hierarchy is, the origin of the hierarchy, of the idea of hierarchy, is not quite Christian. It's rather opposite to Christianity. It emerged it came out of a Neoplatonic idea from the Proclus' concept of hierarchical structure of the divine being, which was borrowed by Pseudo-Dionysius, became popular in the church, and that's how it was implemented. I was very much surprised that the very word hierarchy does not appear earlier than in the 4th century in the church's vocabulary. It appears in the text which belongs to the 3rd century, but in pseudographic texts. So the word is quite late, and it reflects exactly the later development in the church's structures. At the same time, hierarchy should not be confused with ministry. Hierarchy structures ministry, but ministry belongs, I believe, to the core of the church. It is really essential. It always was in the church. It always existed in the church. And at some stage, it began being structured hierarchically, following some patterns of the Neoplatonic thinking, patterns of the Roman administration, and so forth. So I distinguish between ministry and hierarchy, and believe that ministry belongs to the nature of the church, while hierarchy is a scaffold, it's a structure whose purpose was to facilitate a ministry to be a practice exercised in the most effective way. Then I should say also that hierarchy was invented in order to facilitate, to optimize ministry. And structures, including hierarchy, are always a matter of convenience and convention. They do not function in the capacity of jus divinum or in the capacity of divine institutions. And as such, they can be abusive and abused. The distinction between the nature and the structures of the church, I believe, gives a clue to a critical ecclesiology. And the purpose of our session here is to discuss critical ecclesiology, meaning that we can and should criticize ecclesiological theories, but we also have to discuss whether critique is applicable to the church, where we can criticize the church as such. And I believe this distinction between nature and structures of the church gives us a way to criticize the church in a constructive way, to avoid blasphemy, to avoid criticism against the nature of the church, which is given from God and which is innocent, which is really divine, and at the same time be able to criticize church structures which are human inventions. I would say that the very composition of the church is given from God. It's the creation of God. Even the coexistence of humanity and divinity within the church is given from God. But the human element in the church includes also creative capacity, that humans can create, can imitate the creation of God, can create structures. And because the structures are creation of the human beings in the church, they are not perfect. They fail, and therefore they can be criticized. Moreover, they should be criticized. And criticism, critiquing these structures of the church is the only way to keep them in good shape, to keep them in the condition which corresponds to their original meaning, to their original rationale. And that is the criterion of healthy structures. If the structures correspond to their initial, original meaning, rationale of why they were invented, why they were introduced to the church, then they function in the proper way. When they deviate from the original meaning, the structures, then they should be corrected and not exactly deconstructed, but rather reconstructed in accordance with their original meaning. And I believe that would be the purpose of the critical ecclesiology. Now, I would like, in the conclusion, to apply this distinction to the topic of our conference, to the synodality. We just finished, as Johannes Oeldemann just announced, that we've just finished a study about the primacy and synodality by St. Irenaeus group, which was a major achievement of a work which lasted for over 10 years. And this is really an achievement, a landmark in the perception of primacy and synodality by both the Catholic and the Orthodox churches. And I'm happy that this study is off. And the basic idea of this study is that primacy and synodality should be in balance with one another. They should complement one another. At the same time, I would say that, from my own perspective, that they are not quite equal according to the, I believe, to the Orthodox perception. Because in my kind of opinion, primacy does not belong to the nature of the church. That is kind of one of the hypotheses that I promote. While synodality does belong to the nature of the church. Synodality is innate in the nature of the church. It is something that the church never existed without. While primacy, I believe, is a convenient structure, it's not a jus divinum. It's something that gets extrapolated, that projects to the structures of the church, primacy. And from the Orthodox perspective, I believe that primacy reflects, on the structural level, primacy reflects the idea of unity of the church. Primacy expresses the unity of the church. The unity church belongs to the nature of the church. It is very essential for the church that the church is one. The nature of the church is one. And it gets interpreted, it gets reflected in the structures of the church as primacy. Therefore, I believe primacy belongs to the structures of the church, to this changeable, convenient, and conventional aspect of the church. Synodality is innate, as I said. But there are different structural forms of synodality, like apostolic ecumenical councils and Dimusa synodos, local councils, clerical laic congresses, clerical laication elections, and so forth. So those are kind of structures of the synodality, but synodality as such is very much innate in the nature of the church. So I believe this may help to contribute to the realm, to the discipline of critical theology, critical ecclesiology, this distinction. I hope that this may help to contribute to the dialogue, particularly Orthodox Catholic dialogue. The idea of primacy is very central to the church and to the dialogue. And I will be ready to any sort of criticism to this theory. And I still have maybe 1 or 2 minutes for a question. I'm sorry for being not disciplined in myself.